This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from an undisclosed location as I'm away with my family on holiday. But holidays notwithstanding, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for ESG and T-shirts at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke. And listeners, I can confirm of all the places Luke's joining us from, it's not Hawaii.
No brewing scandal.
No brewing scandal.
Thanks for that, Frankie.
But I mean, look, it's early days, Luke. I mean, we look forward to hearing more of your exploits. I, however, am joining you from Gadigal country, as per usual.
Good on you. And a man who recently combined his two great loves, hard science fiction and dodgy spreadsheets, to expose the folly of Elon Musk's plans to colonise Mars, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Two great tastes that taste great together. Huzzah for spreadsheets and space. And I will say, which I don't normally say because I'm usually on the same land as Luke, that I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land.
All right. Well, on this week's show, we look at a new report that digs into the policy detail on how to get Australian homes off gas. But first, the quarterly update of Australia's national greenhouse gas inventory is the regular scorecard on how our nation is faring in the emissions reduction stakes. The figures for December 2022 were released last month and showed that while emissions were down in some sectors, they were up in others, resulting in a result that was essentially flatlining. Right, Frankie?
Yes, and I'm sort of delighted that we're revisiting the national accounts. I think the last time we spoke about this, I was waxing lyrical about doing this regularly where it becomes a form of sleep therapy, like the BBC's shipping forecasts.
It is true.
I'm very glad to bring you the latest edition of the National Greenhouse Inventory.
Will this be inducing an untroubled sleep or some tossing and turning?
This latest quarterly update is the December quarter of 2022, and it basically shows that sort of on the previous year we're down 0.4%, or 2 megatons of CO2 equivalent on the previous year. And in terms of looking across the different sectors, there's been ongoing reductions in emissions from the electricity sector, so that's down 3.5%. You've got a slight decrease in fugitive emissions, and that's sort of reflecting a bit of reduced production in coal mining due to some really heavy rain that was disrupting a lot of activity in New South Wales and Queensland, as well as decreased emissions from stationary energy. That was down a little bit, I think 1.5%. And we had a slight increase, or actually not slight, substantial-ish increase in transport emissions. That was up almost 5%. And that, I think, reflects a continued recovery from COVID-related travel restrictions, particularly domestic aviation picking up. And we had a little bit of an increase in agriculture, up to about 2.5%, and again sort of returning more to pre-drought levels as some of the livestock numbers increase again. So I don't know that I hope I haven't got you sufficiently sleepy from rattling off those numbers. But maybe the macro kind of point to make here is that there's sort of movements between the sectors kind of up and down, but the overall trend is pretty flat, and that's really kind of not good enough for what we need to be doing, either quarter on quarter or year on year, if we're going to meet our 2030 target of 43%. I think that would be demanding, rather than sort of 0.4% in the region of kind of 4 to 5% a year. So maybe that's the clarion call from this. Yeah.
Well, so we had a slow 2022 emissions reduction wise on net. I guess it's not super surprising that post-COVID transport has been recovering substantially, not all the way back up to, at least in these figures, to where it was pre-COVID, but a lot of the way back up. Air travel very dramatically recovering. diesel and petrol use for transport. But that's not super surprising, but the net national figures need to start turning around pretty dramatically. And we can see some drivers for doing so. The safeguard reforms will make a difference both to the industrial and stationary energy and fugitives piece of this, but also through the mechanism of offsets to the land sector piece of this. But safeguard can't do it alone. And I think whether we're going to be able to maintain the pace of transformation that all of us have had in mind as likely to happen or expected to happen in electricity, which underpins a lot of other things, including some we'll talk about later in this episode, like that's a big question. Are we just gearing up for an acceleration there after a bit up, a bit down in the past 18 months? Or do we have further bumps ahead? How's your anxiety level, Luke?
Well, I don't know. I'm feeling pretty relaxed here on holiday, but I have not been following the energy and climate media as closely as I usually do. But when it has flicked past in my feeds, I am sensing increased anxiety, building anxiety around the particularly infrastructure bottlenecks that are being experienced in the renewables space. A big chunk of that 43% emissions reduction target is slated to be delivered by electricity sector decarbonisation. How are you all feeling back there in Australia when it comes to the achievability of that goal?
So I think I've been occupying all points on the anxiety to hopefulness spectrum in recent times. There have been a lot of increasing nerves about the Eraring retirement in New South Wales in 2025, and are the expected reliability outcomes going to go absolutely into the red zone when that happens or not? And we have seen specific bits of kit get delayed. Snowy 2 is famously now not expected on the operator's own timetable till the end of 2029. That's a little way off. There's all this resistance to every major transmission project. But there are some reasons to think that we may be turning this situation around as well. So the states and the feds and the market operator have been working in different ways on the social licence for transmission problem, and some of that has been rerouting or altering the route of some of the more controversial projects. Some of it has been agreeing new ways of and new amounts for financially compensating both landholders and communities for the impositions that these mega transmission lines will mean for them. And we've seen the feds put in place the financial side of things to help accelerate these projects. First, of course, with transmission through the Rewiring the Nation Fund. But just a few days before we're recording, the first wave of activity under the Federal Capacity Investment Scheme was announced to be expanding to include money for battery storage projects quite urgently in New South Wales, as well as the previously announced auction push in Victoria and South Australia. Now, transmission is not quick to approve or build. Pumped hydro clearly is not quick to build. Batteries can, if the supply chain lines up, be put in place quite quickly. They can't do everything. But the battery projects and the other rapid energy upgrades that are in the offing should be helpful. But I don't know. I think that 2025 is still going to look pretty hairy, and I would not be surprised if we're having a lot of conversations about extending Eraring. Although, not only would that be obviously not great from an emissions point of view, it's unclear how much more reliability that would really buy, given the both the state of these old coal-fired power stations themselves and the potential that extending one induces another to exit faster. So there's no just wrap yourself up in a great big doona of no change and things will be fine here. It is build the new system or watch the old one fall down around your ears. I don't know. Is that less anxiety?
Well, the reality is, and I think we've known this for some time, is that we're building the system in front of us as we roll through this decade, and it's going to require careful and active management by both the state and the federal governments. I think the Minns government has recognised that with this, what they call it, an electricity sector checkup.
Yep.
A short, rapid review of the state of play in New South Wales, considering Eraring in particular, but also, you know, the various resources that they can bring to bear to ensure that, you know, fundamentally, what are we talking about? Supply matching demand. One of the things that we can reflect on in the midst of all of this is the role of energy efficiency and energy management in supporting that transition. And energy efficiency obviously makes the task easier because you need to build less stuff on the supply side. Energy management can help align loads with the energy that is available, particularly in the middle of the day, aligning it with the availability of solar generation in particular. Now, that stuff can be hard to ramp up quickly, but this is, you know, a story that we've seen a few times before now over the last decade, and we can expect to see it a few more times over the next decade. So getting our ducks lined up so that we can bring more of those demand-side resources to bear on these pinch points as we move through would, in my view, be eminently sensible. And I can say that just as like a private citizen, because at the moment I'm not CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council. That's just my actual view. I will be back in like 3 weeks.
Freewheeling, wild and crazy Luke is saying whatever comes to mind in a stream of consciousness, but bizarrely, it's the same sort of thing that he usually says.
I feel like you might be alarming listeners with this talk of distance. Like, we can also assure you he's not on, like, the International Space Station or something like that.
I'm not on one of Elon Musk's rockets, Frankie, hurtling towards Mars.
So I don't have a spreadsheet to establish your implausibility, Luke. You remain potentially plausible.
So, I don't know. Do we have anything more to say about this?
Well, I think your point about not waiting to get on with different bits of this transition is a salient point for the paper we're talking about on this episode, right? Feels like a pretty good segue to get stuck into what to do about gas.
What to do about gas?
Really needs an adaptation of the what to do with a problem like Maria.
I was going to say that. I was like, how do you solve a problem like fossil gas?
Natural gas. Needs some work.
Yes.
Let's put that one in the slow cooker.
The debate around how we decarbonise gas use is heating up right around the world, and Australia is no exception. Gas is responsible for 22% of Aussie emissions, the bulk of which are associated with processing LNG for export, electricity generation and the manufacturing sector. But there are also over 5 million homes on Australia's gas network, and in aggregate they are significant gas users, especially in states like Victoria. The good news is we have the technology to get them off gas. The more challenging news is that actually doing it is one of the great public policy challenges of our generation. One organisation that is not shy of a challenge is the Grattan Institute, Institute, and they have waded into the debate with a new report titled Getting Off Gas: Why, How and Who Should Pay. In it, authors Tony Wood, Alison Reeve and Esther Suckling set out why electrification is the way to go in homes, the scale of the task before us, and some of the key policies that, in their view, will be crucial for getting this transition done in a way that is both timely and equitable. Tennant, what did you make of it?
So, this report is bursting with ideas. It's only covering one major chunk of the transition that it's talking about. It is really laser focused on the household side of it. It has some additional thoughts on commercial and government buildings and really just some markers around industrial and power. But it's in the space that it's focused on, households, and all the network assets that are bound up currently in servicing households. It's really thoughtful. It's got a lot of ideas about how to resolve this very, very big challenge. And I think we're going to be chewing over bits of this report for a long time to come. In a good way, not in a gristly, boy, I found that hard to swallow kind of way. But broadly, their view is we've got to get off natural gas because of net zero goals. Gas is no longer a transition fuel in their view, but a residual in power and a thing to either it's the status quo or a thing to skip over in industry on the way to zero emission solutions. And we've got to get going on this change quite quickly because there's a hell of a lot of appliances out there. There's more all the time. The longer you wait, the harder it is both to get to net zero and the more costly it is because of all the additional investment that will have happened by the time that you get around to doing something. They think about all the alternatives, electrification, hydrogen, biogas, and in the household space, they conclude very firmly that electrification is the vast bulk of the answer. They think that biogas will never be enough of it to make it a viable solution for this piece of the problem. They think it's got a role elsewhere. Hydrogen, they think it will never make sense to do hydrogen for the household sector, both because of cost issues. They also raise some concerns around indoor air quality, with hydrogen stovetops being a greater issue than the concerns that have been raised about gas stovetops, basically because hydrogen combustion takes place at a much higher temperature and is more likely to produce oxides of nitrogen, which are one major air pollutant. So I don't know if everybody is going to agree that electrification's 100% of the answer here or close to it, but a lot of people certainly are, and they proceed from there to how do you make massive electrification of households happen. And it's not easy. And I think they are commendably upfront about how not easy it is.
I think hence the call for starting now, right?
Yeah.
This is a big, complex transition, and I think the focus on households is useful because to think about just the sheer numbers involved requires, I think, some sort of very clear and long-term policy certainty and communication about the direction of travel, because we are talking about millions of homes across the country. I think they even have some neat stats on, just even say Victoria, the state that relies most on gas, would need to be taking a couple hundred homes off gas every day until 2045 to achieve net zero. Hence the call to start now.
And that's just to interrupt. That's a slower timetable than what's implied by the state government's own emissions target, which would see most of that happen like 10 years earlier. So big numbers.
Well, I wondered about that, and we've touched on things like the Australian government signing up to the Global Methane Pledge, which, we've got to get a 30% reduction on 2020 levels by 2030. Your point, Tennant, Victoria's just signed up to a very, very ambitious 2035 emissions reduction target.
75 to 80.
75 to 80.
As recommended by some wild-eyed, disreputable people.
Including one T. Reid.
I don't know him.
But there's no way you meet that target without starting to deal with the household use of fossil gas in some meaningful way. So if you look at their big recommendations, first, it's all about certainty, right?
Yep.
Governments should provide certainty by setting dates for the end of gas use. By certain dates, you won't be able to either connect to the gas grid, or you won't be able to buy gas appliances any longer. We need some certainty over that, so that households can plan, but also manufacturers and network businesses can think about their future as well, which are some of the issues unpacked in this report. Second, we need this approach to sort of long-term, consistent communication, which is very much being clear on the direction of travel, articulating the benefits of why households should switch to all electric and how they should do it. Third, their point is we shouldn't be making the problem worse, and so there should be an immediate ban on new gas connections to homes, and they lump small businesses in with that as well. So let's not keep creating more homes that need to be retrofitted down the track. Let's put a stop to new connections now as a bit of a no regrets measure that they can do straight away. And then further than that, eliminate any other regulatory barriers to all electric homes. There are definitely things that need to be done on lowering the cost hurdles. There are high upfront costs for switching to all electric appliances compared to some of the gas equivalents. So there is a role for government support through grants and through finance, which we'll unpack. And lastly, that we need to set a date and sort of phase out the sale of fossil gas appliances altogether. So you're sort of dealing with the new almost immediately, and then planning for the long term so that you can start removing those appliances from circulation. So it's a pretty big agenda.
So can I just start with the contention that governments should be putting a flag in the sand and saying by this date we're going to be shutting down the gas network? But I think it's useful to unpack why they think that the evidence is such that that is justified at this point in our trajectory towards net zero emissions. A lot of the reasoning around the relative benefits of electrification versus hydrogen have been well canvassed on this podcast. Indeed, just a couple of episodes ago, we did that report from the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, The Future of Gas, which looked at this more broadly, looked beyond residential sector, but many of the points that report made, the Grattan Institute makes about, electrification is available now. The possibility of hydrogen playing a big role is incredibly uncertain. Looking at this in an Australian context, they'd make some simple points, right? To critics that say, no, we should keep our options open. We should wait and see how these various technologies play out. They make the point that, importantly, if hydrogen was ultimately to take the full load that is currently being relied on for all those hydrocarbons, lots of stuff would all need to go right. You would need to have massive cost reductions, and you would need to build entirely new appliance supply chains. And even if all those things happened, the switch when you made it would have to happen incredibly quickly to have any hope of dealing with the emissions from that sector on the timeline that we need it to. It is already a huge and complex task to electrify the 5 million odd homes around the country that are connected to the gas network. There's a huge amount for governments to think about in this space. A lot of competing priorities, a lot of equity issues, a lot of staging issues in terms of shutting down the gas network, which are incredibly complex. It would seem like a completely ridiculous task to take on, except the alternative, which is going down a hydrogen pathway, is even more complicated and much more uncertain because it's based on unproven technology, and it's based on assumptions around hydrogen costs, which at this point just don't seem credible.
Yeah, it's also, and like we have made this point before in looking at the other literature we've discussed on this podcast. Cheap green hydrogen relies on cheap green electricity being a thing at scale. And so given that we have established technology available like today in 2023 in the form of magic heat pumps, like it's just very hard to contemplate the amount of green hydrogen necessary being cost competitive with something that's already very efficient and cheap to run in 2023. We're already seeing global demand for heat pumps in particular, and into the related technology you need to electrify increasing enormously in demand. Whereas, as you say, Luke, I think the only way you get a hydrogen gas burner for your stove cooktop is some sort of prototype. Like these things aren't even close to being commercialised yet.
Well, they make the point that 30% of Australian homes are all electric now. What percentage of homes are dual fuel, hydrogen, electric? 0?
There's a tiny, like not even a rounding error, but a very small number of homes in test regions, very small regions, that have got some significant blending going on. But to a first approximation, no, there's none. But in this area, I want to register something that is one of my few gripes with this report, which is that for those who do make a serious argument for the hydrogen pathway, the number one tool in their belt is concern about the network costs of augmenting the electricity system to handle the extra peak load from electrifying home heating, like especially home heating. And this report acknowledges that concern. It's got a great discussion of all the sensible things that should be done to manage and avert the impacts that we could have if, for instance, we electrify with like bad appliances, electric resistance heaters that are poorly concerted and not well used. They do acknowledge that risk of electrification-related network costs, and they provide some reasons to think that those costs can be much lower than they themselves have warned in the past. But they don't incorporate that into their cost assessment of the pathways. And I think there's still an ecological niche for somebody to do a truly comprehensive modelling exercise that takes this particular electrification quality concern seriously and runs a bunch of scenarios for how well we do electrification versus reliance on a mix with all the problems, the very real problems that you guys and Grattan note of relying on biogas and hydrogen. I think that the advice that they give on like what to do next once you've settled on the electrification pathway is excellent advice. I think they leave some room for doubt, even without taking account of what we do with the costs of shutting down the network, which they do raise some very important points about. But again, they don't figure into that which is the best pathway calculation, at least not explicitly.
I agree with you. And I think that is a big hole in a lot of the analysis that's floating around at the minute. Just doing the big, hairy modelling exercise to look around those total system costs associated with various decarbonisation pathways, specifically around gas.
Yep.
And until we do that, there will still be room for uncertainty, bad actors to throw all kinds of numbers around. Once we have that, there should be a fair amount of clarity. But I think your point is really important, that it is not, necessarily just a hydrogen versus electrification deathmatch. It is hydrogen versus the various sort of sophistication of electrification one could pursue. There's dumb electrification, which would be a bunch of electric resistive heaters and no consultation with renewables. And I would make a prediction that would end up faring fairly poorly. I don't know if it'd be worse than hydrogen, but it would look pretty expensive. Using heat pumps and making sure that you are doing that smart energy management to ensure that the new electric loads are aligning with the availability of renewable energy, and it starts to look a lot happier, would be my prediction. But someone needs to do the work, and it's in some ways remarkable that it hasn't been done, but it is a big task, and it's a hole that we see not just in Australia but in other places as well. I mean, you had the same critique of the report out of the European Academy's tenet.
It's almost like I'm a broken record with no original thoughts.
It's almost like you're a spreadsheet aficionado that wants another big hairy spreadsheet to dig into, mate.
Well, I mean, unsurprisingly, we're all in furious agreement, because until that bit of work is done, and I mean, the reason perhaps for that not having happened yet in Australia, as we were sort of reflecting earlier, there hasn't been a policy signal from either the federal government or kind of more explicitly from state governments, even if they have set rather ambitious, medium-term decarbonisation goals. We don't have that sort of signal about the direction of travel, and one would think a government's probably not going to do that until it has done that work and thought about, not just the costs of what would be a really interesting exercise on the different combinations of doing electrification. Because, this report doesn't talk about EVs, but that's another kind of significant electrical load that's going to presumably require investment in network augmentation.
Or a lot of investment in avoiding network augmentation. But either way, you've got to do a lot.
Absolutely. And so the way that technology gets wrapped into households across the country is enormously consequential, as is having a clear-eyed look at, just what you'd be in for if you did want to, look at pursuing the potential of a, hydrogen gas distribution network. I think the proponents of that are making all kinds of claims about the costs of augmenting the electricity network, but have very little to say about what would need to be done to bring the distribution network up to par to cope with hydrogen. You'd need to replace large chunks of that too, and replace appliances in people's homes, and all the things that we've already talked about. So I think we just need the evidence base to work from. That said, this paper that Grattan's done, not having done that analysis, and one could argue it's potentially not their role to have to do such an enormous exercise, needs to be done. But this, the report does contemplate a lot of the public policy interventions you would need to do to look at staging that transition and providing that certainty.
And there's a lot of them. An idea that came across in this report that I thought was really interesting and I think very sensible is they've got several versions of a switch in policy from handouts to phase-outs over time. So there's for generic households, for renters and landlords, for public housing, there's a gradation between starting out with goodies for everyone, tax credits or grants or public funding to get things done. But that is paired with a timetable on which eventually the handouts stop, and standards or bans or other firm sort of regulatory sticks take over and drive the rest of the change, and that those two things work together. That they don't quite articulate it like this, but the carrots create the conditions for acceptability of the sticks, and the sticks take over because the carrots are ultimately unaffordable if you're just going out and throwing money at people rather than changing what business as usual looks like. You've got an unsupportable burden on public finances over time. There's some bits of this that have to be publicly financed all the way, and like social housing is the most obvious piece of that. But there's a lot of others where what private investment goes into, and most crucially, what kit is the obvious, quick, available thing to put in when your old space heater or water heater or oven gives up the ghost. Nobody's doing, though it grieves me to say, nobody's doing a spreadsheet when their shower is running cold. They are saying, fix this now, and what is the thing that the plumber or the electrician or whoever is going to have on hand or be able to run off to Bunnings and get to install the next day? That's a very crucial question that you can't solve through incentive programs.
Yes, and they do make the important point that you can get a lot of the way there by just dealing with that replacement market, right? So the number they call out is that in Victoria, around 423, which is a very specific figure, but there you go, 423 water heaters reach the end of their lifespan each day, and they compare that with what it would take to get all homes off gas by 2045, which, as we acknowledge, is probably a decade too late, but let's go with it, 274 per day. So you can do a lot with the water heaters that are just crapping out, but there needs to be the efficient heat pump hot water systems in the warehouses ready to go. You need the plumbers that are, taking the call to be confident in that technology and advising households appropriately, and have the right skills and expertise. And there's a little bit of a conversation here about some of the upskilling that plumbers will need to do to get this done. There's a whole ecosystem that needs to be created, right? And I think the report is quite smart about the role of the carrots, the incentives in scaling up that ecosystem to a point where it can actually carry the load of that larger sort of task that we'll get into hopefully in the back half of this decade and beyond. But it's going to take some time. And the important thing about the carrots and the sticks, and this sometimes gets lost, is that the carrots are more effective if you know the stick is coming. And so one of the things they talk about is tax breaks for landlords to electrify their rental properties. If you're a landlord, and landlords have a lot of things on their minds, and switching out heat pumps for gas appliances is probably not at the top of many landlords' list of things to do. But if you know that you're going to have to do it by X date, and that there is a subsidy on the table if you do it now, then your interest in that likely goes up quite a bit, and you get out of the realm of the early adopters and the folk that are doing it for other values reasons, and you start to drive some significant change in the market. And then that allows you, when you get to that point, you've got comfort with the technology. A lot of people have been using it. There starts to create an expectation among renters that this is a thing, and you're off to the races.
And I think because we haven't had, and the report reflects on this, we haven't had a national scheme around disclosure of the performance of homes, despite this being something that all governments committed to doing a really, really long time ago, like almost 20 years. You can't attribute a value to having made that investment for landlords. And because, Australia is a country of, by and large, the people who own investment properties will own like one or two, right? Like these aren't big institutional owners of property. That's not how the Australian market's comprised. Like their attention, they're just, like a lot of other people, maybe don't have the spare cash lying around to do big upgrades. So the upfront capital investment can also be a barrier in that sense. So I thought agreed with you. I think the prospect of, say in the rental market, and they do make a really good point of stepping out that this transition is going to be a lot harder for renters and apartment owners, because also the complexity of the buildings and the governance structures around those are more complex as well, makes them a priority for government policy making. So yes to the tax breaks as the carrot that paves the way for the stick, which inevitably should be minimum standards for rental properties. It was good to see them include a shout out for, obviously not just that you would by a certain date require all rental properties to be all electric, but we need to be combining that upgrade with energy efficiency upgrades and, the really common sense things around, insulation, draft proofing, where you can do kind of other facade upgrades. Those should be incorporated as a priority. I think as a part tenant of your contention around the quality of electrification piece being complemented with a really strong agenda on energy efficiency. And so, I thought it was really good they stepped through that, very complex in apartments, because you've got, in the case of sort of large apartments, some of those services are centralized. So that means if you want to change those systems, the whole body corporate needs to agree to that. And I think anyone who's had any involvement, in a strata would reflect on sometimes how hard it is to get decisions made about those changes. I think they also say you do also just need to acknowledge that in some contexts, this transition is going to take a little longer. And so, larger, more complex buildings like apartments, even commercial office towers and the like, present some more technical and sort of governance complexity around them that you also need to factor in. Hence, wanting to really ramp up and try and focus on where some of the, the potential, the early movers and the easier wins might be.
So I walked away from this report with an even deeper appreciation for how tough the upgrade task is going to be, both because they explain very carefully how less than half of total households are what you might consider straightforward to upgrade. You've got nearly a third of households are rentals. You've got a wedge of low-income households in their numbers, a little less than 5%. You've got multi-unit dwellings that are a little less than 10%. People with just low savings and who will find it hard to front a major upgrade of this sort, another 15%. And then you have the fact that from the consumer attitudes research that they did and cite, households are just not particularly wild about electrification. Like they're okay with electric appliances in some contexts. There's more attachment to gas stoves for those who use them, but they're not suggesting that there is this immense groundswell of bottled up enthusiasm that's just waiting for the program that will make the spreadsheets add up. It's all parts of this are going to be, for a while at least, an uphill push.
And from that communications point of view and the public sentiment point of view, I really enjoyed their analogy with the rollout of digital television actually started happening in I think it was 2010, they said. But the decision to move to digital happened in the late 90s, and there was effectively a 10, 11, 12-year communications campaign informing the public that this was coming. It's still coming.
Yep.
Get ready, people. You're going to have to buy a new TV. This whole thing over a long period of time that wasn't. Then everybody, to all intents and purposes, has a television. So this is something that touches every home. There's something obviously there's a lot simpler than a transition away from gas because you unplug one appliance and plug another one in. But there is some complexity there, and there's habits and different things that one has to grapple with as you're using that different technology. But the point was that long range vision, and that comes back to, I guess, their point around the importance of setting an end date and providing that clarity that we're all on this journey. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but at some point in the next X years, this is something that you're going to need to deal with, and there's support along the way.
Yeah.
And having that long-term view is really important. And it goes back, notwithstanding the need for big, hairy spreadsheets to kind of prove this case up once and for all, but it goes back to the importance of getting started, because it's not just getting started on, building up the ecosystem and the supply chains and the skills and all of that stuff that we bang on about all the time. It's also about shifting the public sentiment, building the literacy, getting people on that journey. And the longer that we prevaricate, the longer that we, persist with this idea that, we don't know and, maybe hydrogen will come along and solve all our problems, although it won't, because it's just as complicated in different ways, if not more so. Giving up on that opportunity to have that important public conversation.
One of the other, arguments that exists in that territory, right, is the argument to maybe we should hold off and without thinking about the true challenge of deployment of this kind of transition at scale is if I switch everything to all electric right now, and the grid in Victoria is very brown coal dominated, is that going to, that's a worse emissions outcome to switch everything.
Reply guys on Twitter are very worried about this.
Okay, righto.
Yes, I can attest to that.
Well, and but the simple fact is this thing isn't going to happen overnight. And if you've got, particularly in those states that are, targeting close to, 100%, 90 to 100% renewables by the end of the decade, I think it'd be a great problem to have in a way if you thought you could ramp up the electrification of homes at scale such that it would potentially keep pace with the transition in the energy system. But the reality is it's absolutely not going to happen overnight. And to think that you could wait until the electricity, sort of system transition was done before flicking a switch and going, okay, now it's safe to go all electric. You're potentially losing, you're going to lose a decade of lost opportunity of, addressing consumer awareness and preferences and starting to get early adopters moving. And the pace of that kind of shift, if you're doing it, particularly around the end of appliance life, ought to be pretty manageable.
So all the bits of transition, the electricity sector piece, the household energy use piece, industry, much more, people, I think, sometimes hope that they are each individually hyper agile, like jet skis, and you can have them just beautifully choreographed, weaving and spraying water in just the right ways, and they're great big cruise ships. You just have to point them in vaguely the right direction and crank up the engine and just look forward and make sure that you're not exploding the ship, and hope that all the other ships are also pointed in the right direction and not going to collide with each other. But there is not agility in transitions of this amount of infrastructure and fleets of consumer equipment. You've got to pick a direction and go for it, and not try to like chivvy the last couple of % of emissions efficiency out of exactly the right coordination, because nothing responds that well.
Yeah, which is why the concept of zero carbon ready homes is so important, because as the electricity system transitions to high penetrations of renewable energy, it makes those homes ready to catch that wave of renewables, right? And the importance of getting that process started, of making sure our housing stock is prepared to be low carbon or zero carbon when that transition takes place, given the scale of the task, is the thing that we should be focused on. Even on the substantive point around a home that went all electric in 2023, higher emissions in that particular year in a state like Victoria, which is grid is still pretty dominated by brown coal. It's true in a particular year, but when you look over a 10-year time horizon, the emissions are lower, which is a point that's made in this report. And when you look over the lifetime of those appliances and beyond those 10 years, that's going to be even more so, right? Like you get better and better off as time goes on.
Well, we haven't talked about the ACT, and they're the jurisdiction that has called it for gas, and they've done that 22 years before their planned end date for the use of gas in 2045. So they've moved to announce there will be a ban in new gas connections for buildings, but they're also going really big with comms, with incentives and finance to help households. I think they've probably got the most generous regime, I think, of any incentives that I've seen around the country. I think you can get up to $5,000, I think, for different electric appliances in rebates. And they're also offering no interest loans for up to $15,000 for people to manage that upfront, investment hurdle which needs to be got over. So, and the other thing they're doing, I think, and perhaps that provides a little bit of a template to other jurisdictions, when they choose to, point to the direction which we're all, I think, agreeing is reasonably inevitable, is that it talks about the benefits of switching, provides advice and links to how you access those rebates, advice on how to choose different appliances, like all the things that this report talks about. The ACT's, I think, moving really early and giving, I think, plenty of time for households to contemplate that transition.
So this report's called Getting Off Gas, Why, How and Who Should Pay. And a lot of the discussion around who should pay is where we go with gas network infrastructure.
Yep.
Right. I guess the question I have for you, Tennant, is do they tell us who should pay, or do they just raise some interesting questions that we need to grapple with to work that question out?
It is the latter. They do put the cards on the table for like what's going to happen here if their advice more broadly is taken, which is that gas networks are going to go into some version of a death spiral where costs for existing users of gas or continuing users of gas go up, most likely, as other users exit the network and the fixed costs of the network are recovered from a smaller number of people. That sends those costs higher, which sends more people off the network, which sends costs higher, which gets worse and worse until the only people left on the network are those who can't afford to get off it, and they're paying for everything. And that clearly doesn't work. And we need, in Grattan's view, to make a grand bargain much earlier on how the costs of this network decline are going to be managed. Both how are we going to minimise those costs, and they've got some great ideas in there about the sequencing of people disconnecting versus abolishing their gas connections, and how the physical costs of the latter removing the gas connection or rendering it permanently unusable can be reduced by doing that whole neighbourhoods at a time rather than digging up hundreds of driveways. So they've got great ideas on that, but you also need to work out what's going to happen with the value of these networks. And a number that they didn't put in this report, I had the delightful opportunity to go and assemble this number for myself. The current regulated asset bases of the gas distribution networks in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia and the ACT sum to a bit over $12 billion. That's the value of the pipes and all the kits to deliver the gas at the distribution level that is expected by the regulatory system. The networks did a combination of building these things and buying government-built networks that had already built these things, but putting private capital into that. They put their money in on the basis that the regulatory system said how much they were allowed to invest and how much they were allowed to earn as a rate of return on that investment, and they would make their money back. Now, Grattan note that there's not an absolute, under all circumstances, guarantee of making your money back, but it's a pretty strong expectation. And so what are we going to do about that? Are the networks going to eat it all and just go, oh dear, $12 billion down the drain? Probably not. Are we going to recover that all $12 billion in disconnection fees every time someone leaves the network? Probably not. Are governments going to take a portion of that onto the public books and socialise us some losses? Well, maybe. And Grattan say it is important to resolve this, and they don't say exactly how you should resolve it. But it's quite a lot of money.
And it's another reason why you need a date, right? Because if you understand the date, you understand the total quantum of money that needs to be found and the time over which you need to find it, which is incredibly helpful.
And it does feel like you sort of said that, it is likely to be this grand bargain where it's likely the solution's probably going to be a little bit of all the above, right? That if you had the certainty about the direction and a date, you could better regulate how much of that cost should equitably be borne by consumers. They also make the point that the regulatory framework we've got in this country probably isn't fit for purpose for managing this transition. In that national gas law and the national electricity law kind of treats the consumers of those networks as entirely separate. But if you're a gas consumer, you're almost certainly an electricity consumer. So they make the point, and by pointing to places like the EU that are kind of developing, a broader framework that supports the integration of, gas, electricity, the promise of, hydrogen markets and systems down the track, to make sure that you're splitting costs fairly across that consumer base, and that you're also planning properly around the, however much of the existing gas network you would want to repurpose for hydrogen, but setting, clear boundaries and limits around that. So Grattan's not shy of saying that the AER, the regulator, have probably done about as much as they can do within the existing kind of regulatory framework. They've provided accelerated depreciation to gas network businesses, which might help them in the short term, but in the long term probably is going to drive or accelerate a shift to the death spiral if they're allowed to charge more to consumers that are left on that network earlier. That's only likely to accelerate that trend if that indeed takes off. So they do point to the need for regulatory reform, but really that is very much sitting with the energy ministers to set a direction and a program of reform about these things.
Yeah, that was where they landed. It was like, over to you, energy ministers.
Yeah, pretty much. Might as well
you tell
be
us
the
who
last
should pay.
line of the report, right?
So just one note about why governments to date might have preferred ambiguous, well, we don't really know what's going to be the answer here, and why don't we let 1,000 flowers bloom? Is I don't know, of all the spreadsheets that I've dodgily done, this might be among the dodgiest, but I tried to have a go at if with that $12 billion, what would be the budget cost of the government's just covering the capital repayments and the return on capital while there was capital to repay versus what would be the cost if they just bought out the whole regulated asset base now, borrowing the money to do so. And they're big dollars. It's somewhere between on the cover the difference while running down the value of the network, $1 billion a year for the first few years, coming down over 30 years to $400 million a year. And on the other one, something like $400-500 million a year of interest payments for the next 30 years. Now, those numbers could be totally wrong. This is possibly the crappiest spreadsheet I've ever done. But $12 billion of asset value is going to be noticed, whether it's coming off households or the budget or investors in Singapore and Hong Kong. $12 billion will be missed.
Yes, so I think that's right, and that's why I think they, to the degree that they suggest a compass bearing, they suggest some sort of grand bargain where there's, a little bit of pain shed by consumers, the network owners and governments. I think the thing that they're most concerned about, and appropriately so, is vulnerable consumers and consumers that, could get left stranded on the gas network, just getting it in the neck in a poorly managed transition. And that is something which nobody's going to have any appetite for and would be politically untenable. You know what else is politically untenable? We're not in a position, we're not at a stage of the debate right now where any government could contemplate taking on every single one of these recommendations and just forging ahead into this brave new world. We haven't had enough of a conversation as, the way they characterise the current sentiment. I don't think the Australian public is really ready for this, but the only way they will get ready for it is if we start talking about it, and by we I mean, folk that are engaged in the art of politics mainly. I mean, they need to start creating this space, advocates and experts, broadly across this is the broad trajectory of travel, but for something that's so inherent to the daily lives of so many Australians, I think there's a big literacy gap there, and one that needs to be filled quickly so that we're in a position to make some of the big decisions that necessarily need to be made at a political level for us to get this done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also fear of just how this might be politicised in a way that you've seen happen in, countries like the US, where it's, become a little bit of culture war territory, really. I think we've talked about that in the past on this podcast. So, I think it'd be in everyone's interest to avoid that quality of discussion in this country.
Grattan launch a preemptive strike on culture war by having a very calming, relaxing little box that explains why your gas barbecue is going to be fine.
That's right. Which we sort of skipped over because we didn't talk about LPG and the role that it kind of plays.
That's a wise time management decision to continue skipping.
No. Suffice to say, they've got some ideas on how you can keep having a barbecue and it won't impact on emissions too much.
I think that's one area where they are excited about hydrogen playing a role in.
Yeah. You know what we've sort of just touched on, but not but not acknowledged, I think, fully, was what they had to say about supply chains and workforce.
Yeah.
There were a couple of points they made rather strongly. I think one very practical, and I think taking some inspiration from elsewhere overseas around the skills piece. So, we know that the energy transition more broadly is going to demand more qualified electricians than we have at the moment. So, the demand for that will continue to grow, and I think there's already signs that that those skills are in short supply in this country, so there needs to be some investment to support that. But they also point out that with widespread electrification, there would be an impact to the plumbing industry, which are the workers that typically do gas appliance installation and maintenance. And one of their suggestions around that transition piece is to basically allow for for new plumbers coming into the industry as part of their certificate 3 to require them to have a restricted electrical license, which would allow them to install heat pumps for hot water and reverse cycle air conditioners, so to just add a bit of time to their apprenticeship.
8 days, apparently.
Yeah, it's not much.
Yeah, which is rather impressive. So it just feels like one of those really common sense recommendations where you can be encouraging a slightly broader skill set amongst people who are already going to be qualified to do most parts of this work by tapping into another skills base and providing a pathway, I think, to transition as you would start to see some more structural decline for plumbing services with people, getting rid of their gas appliances over time. So I thought that was really good. And the other thing that they were pretty strong on was that they didn't think potentially there was a role for us to really be boosting domestic manufacturing capability to deliver all the stuff that we need to be replacing our gas appliances with.
Because our labour costs are too high, Frankie.
That's right.
We should leave it to the EU and the US.
You sound unconvinced, Luke.
Well, we have oft remarked on this pod that it's unlikely we could compete with the what was it? Carrot storm. I don't know. I don't know what your...
A hurricane of carrots?
A hurricane of carrots that the Inflation Reduction Act is chucking at proponents for choosing to set up shop in the US. So, can't compete on subsidies in all likelihood. And also just on that mass scale of manufacturing because of our labour costs. So, we should be focusing on having the right settings to attract, quality, high efficiency products and hopefully getting some of the benefit from free trade agreements in the works, like that with the EU.
This recommendation was how you know you're not reading a report by the Australia Institute.
Absolutely.
I'm just agnostic, and I with both the EU and the US deploying vast subsidies to ramp up production locally, they're clearly seeing that domestic production is going to play a key role in their energy transition. I just think relying on labour costs alone as the reason why it can't be done and shouldn't be done in Australia, that doesn't quite get me across the line. I've just heard sensible views on both sides, and I find myself agnostic on whether it makes sense to ramp up. I think there's more work to do on that front about whether domestic production of these sorts of technologies has a future in Australia. I don't think there's quite enough evidence on that front.
Sounds like centrist on centrist controversy to me.
There's so many jokes I could make. I'm choosing not to.
I'm not going there.
That's a very de-escalatory attitude. Well done.
All right. I think that's good. We've just crossed the 1 hour mark in the discussion of this excellent report.
Well, look, I blame the Grattan Institute for writing a jam-packed report with so many things worth talking about.
I know.
Bastards.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
I have an episode of Offsets Redux. I'm revisiting a bit of our back catalogue because the long foreshadowed work of the voluntary carbon markets integrity initiative, which was the subject of a previous pod. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Very early one.
Episode 2,
Oh my
gold
God,
medal,
okay.
gold foil or aluminium, the VCMI's draft claims code of conduct.
That very one.
June 23rd, 2022.
So, yeah, in our second ever podcast, we talked about the draft code of practice that was out for consultation. And this was all around creating a framework for non-state actors and companies to make credible claims around their net zero targets and the use of offsets, but put some real structure around those claims. So in the last week, they've published that code of practice, and it was interesting to see sort of how things shook out through that consultation process. So if you want to go, like you're a company and you want to make a claim that I'm going to be VCMI silver, gold, or platinum, were where they landed in the spectrum of the metals, by the way.
No bronze?
No bronze.
They got rid of bronze.
But they put a placeholder in the announcement that they're going to announce some new levels over the next year. So I feel like they're starting with the core offering, and then they're going to
Tungsten, molybdenum.
Are they gamifying emissions reduction?
Oh my God.
Got to catch them all.
I've got to catch them all. So, make your bets now.
Ghost type offsets.
But they've landed on this 4-step process. You're going to meet foundational criteria. And the ones they settled on were around having that, annual publicly disclosed register of your emissions, that you need to be setting science-based near-term emissions reduction targets, as well as the commitment to achieve net zero at the latest by 2050. You need to be demonstrating that you're on track to meeting those interim targets. And importantly, and we've talked about this, you need to demonstrate that your company's public policy advocacy supports the Paris Agreement outcomes and doesn't represent a barrier to sort of ambitious regulation around climate. So it sets out those foundation criteria. It sets out your silver, gold, and platinum, and really the distinction between them is the proportion of offsets that you purchase to cover residual emissions that you've not managed to deal with.
So what's platinum? Because I thought gold was 100%.
No, so the levels.
I mean, this is based on episode 2 knowledge.
I know. Well, I went back. I didn't actually re-listen, but I read some of the notes that we all took from that episode. So if you're gunning for silver, which they say is the most accessible, we'll see if bronze is going to get a look in at some point. But you need to be, demonstrating that you're, as I said, meeting all those foundational criteria. You're on track to achieving your interim targets, and you're dealing with residual emissions by purchasing high quality offsets for 20 to 60% of your remaining emissions. And then for gold, it's got to be 60 up to, but not including 100%. And then for platinum, it's 100% of your residual emissions or more. So you could obviously could be buying more than what your residual emissions are. So that's where they've kind of set it. And the other, I think, steps that are really important here as well is that, obviously, the types of offsets that you choose to purchase is subject to criteria. So they refer to the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market Core Carbon Principles document. So you need to be purchasing offsets that meet those principles, and you also have to get third party assurance on your whole claim against the assessment framework, which they are yet to publish, but will be soon. Anyway, lots in that. I don't know if we would revisit that in a future pod, but I think that the foundations of what we had read in the draft have largely stayed intact, and some of those numbers have firmed up in terms of the levels of performance. And I think the other important development in that time was that the work of that Integrity Council on those core carbon principles on sort of quality of offsets has been launched as well.
Little framework all grown up.
Indeed.
All right. Thanks, Frankie. Tennant, what have you got?
Well, I've got something that's still a work in progress and looking much less like it's coming to a positive conclusion than Frankie's. I'm talking about the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminium, which is the effort that the US and the EU have been negotiating over the past year or so on some kind of trade deal that would discourage trade in dirtily produced metals and encourage trade in cleanly produced metals. And these discussions have, for a long time, they've seemed like a bit confusing because the EU is moving ahead with carbon border adjustment mechanisms within its ETS, and the US is doing a bunch of stuff domestically to subsidise things and internationally to maybe apply tariffs to things. And how were these approaches going to marry up? And it's looking like they might not marry up. So the US have proposed to the EU an approach that involves setting a benchmark for what cleanly produced metals are and applying tariffs to imports of metals that don't meet the benchmark, escalating tariffs based on how far off they are, and also having some characteristics for joining this arrangement. You've got to both meet the benchmarks, and you can't have, for example, too much state-owned enterprise activity in your steel or aluminium sector, which, who on earth could that be a problem for? So the US put this proposal, and the EU have recently come back and said, that sounds totally incompatible with the WTO, and we value the WTO, and we're doing this CBAM thing that's very deliberately designed to be WTO compatible, and we don't think we could agree to the US proposal. So there's going to be more discussions, and we'll put in the show notes some links to the reporting on both the US proposal and the EU response as it's currently known. But this whole discussion, aside from its positive agenda, is about climbing down from the Trump-era national security tariffs that the US put on European and Canadian and other metals exporters. And if they don't resolve it, they might be back in a trade war, which would be a bizarre and unproductive place to be. I would say this also has resonances with another episode where we talked about William Nordhaus's Climate Club's proposal. The US proposal is pretty much a Nordhausian climate club and suffers from the same problem as those did, that it's just out-and-out discrimination from a WTO point of view in the absence of the rules being changed, or people agreeing with the US that, WTO, WT schmo, who cares what the rules say? We're going to do what we like, which is pretty much the vibe from all sides of politics over there. So, excitement for trade aficionados and climate people, and let's hope it doesn't get too exciting.
It strikes me that their noses are pointed in the same direction, right?
Yes.
They're trying to achieve similar outcomes,
yes,
but the difference is on the exact mechanisms to get there. And from, a Nordhaus perspective, from a climate club perspective, were the EU and the US to find, theoretically, hypothetically, some, WTO compliant way of banding together, like that would be incredibly powerful, right?
Yep.
So we should continue to carry the flame of hope in our hearts that they can find a pathway forward. It strikes me that the EU has been on this CBAM pathway for a long time, and the US is, for obvious reasons, relatively new to the conversation, and also has a lot more complexity to work through domestically when it comes to these sorts of matters. So that might be a high bar. But geez, like if they got their act together, that would be incredibly powerful, right?
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't be the first time that people with very similar stated views of what they want to happen found themselves in brutal disagreement over modest differences. Europe has experienced a lot of that over the past 6 centuries. So don't get too optimistic.
Oh, look, I'm just pointing out that there might be some prospect of them sorting their act out at some point. Well, look, for my one more thing, I'm going to point you all to one of my favourite podcasts, Origin Story, which is a sort of explainer for political concepts, ideologies, and figures. I have recommended it before, but we'll do so again as their latest episode is on climate change denial. One thing I will say, that for anyone steeped in climate politics, you probably won't learn a huge amount of new stuff, but it remains an enjoyable interrogation of some of the more unhelpful contributions to the climate debate over the last few decades. Have either of you had a listen to it yet?
I've listened to part 1 and I'm looking forward to part 2. I agree that I didn't learn a vast amount, in part because I had previously read the book Merchants of Doubt, which is a key text summarised in the course of that episode. But they do a great job in general. And if this one wasn't as entertaining as the Winston Churchill one, where they were horrified to discover that at times they quite liked this guy that they were ready to castigate on several fronts, it's still a very solid and informative hour.
Yes, they didn't discover to their surprise that they actually liked the climate change deniers.
No. They don't come around on any of those guys.
I haven't listened to it yet, but I have also read Merchants of Doubt. It's in my climate collection on my bookshelf. So if you all reckon it's a good listen, I'll queue it up for this week.
It's more of an upper than the previous episode on global thermonuclear war.
Well, that's promising.
Yes, all of the great existential threats. That is our show for today. We're all on social media. You can have a yarn with us on Twitter, or you can visit LinkedIn, where you'll find Tennant's treatise on the folly of Elon Musk's rocket ship plans.
The one they tried to suppress. By they, I mean my cat.
Ah, yes. Bringing it full circle. Tennant, we have an email address. What is it and what should people do with it?
It's mailbag@letmesumup.net, and you should send us an email that talks about a paper, past, present or future.
And Frankie, what's going on with those T-shirts?
Worms to open up at this late hour.
I can't believe you've invited that conversation at this late stage.
I'm just shocked that I haven't been shirt franked or whatever it's supposed to be. Shirt franked?
I need shirt franking with fronty.
Fronty.
I think that's the segment we agreed to. I have no substantive updates on the T-shirts. Luke, you should know this. Otherwise, I would have shirt franked you by now. So the fact that I've remained silent on the subject of T-shirts.
All right. Well, in that case, tell us about our website.
Letmesumup.net. Check it out. It's got all of our fabulous back catalogue of episodes, including, I think, several from our back catalogue that are relevant to the paper we unpacked today. So we'll make sure those go in the show notes. You can check it out. As I said, letmesumup.net.
All right. For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
you must be on holiday. I don't know why you would have invited that particular conversation 1 hour and 33 minutes in.
What if there had been something to say?
Guys, I'm on holiday. I've got all afternoon.